Well, evening, everyone.
Good
evening. We've arrived at session 5 in asking the question, the end of religious nationalism. We looked at the politicization and sectarianization of God in week 1. Session 2 was the partition of Ireland and the formation of confessional states. Session 3, no other gods before me, the nature of religious and political idolatry. And last week we looked at the Bible and its resistance to domination systems. So tonight we are secular now, the separation of church and state. Now, it's not long ago, and you probably remember it, when Pope Francis came to Ireland in August 2018, there was no doubt that it was a Republic of Ireland in which there was a clear separation between church and state. And the people of Ireland had decided. The state reception in Dublin Castle was significant for a number of reasons. Most significant, I suppose, was then Taoiseach Leo Varadkar's speech, which warmly welcomed the Pope to Ireland, left Pope Francis in no doubt that church and state were responsible for serious wrongs in Ireland in relation to children and women, and that action was needed. It was clearly stated that the church had a role in Irish life and society, but not a dominant one. Church and state were now separate. Varadkar had made it public, and this suggested that perhaps the state had got it, if the church maybe had not, or was struggling to realize what secular actually means. It does not mean that religion has no place or voice in public life. Secular means the separation of church and state. There is the no longer dominant church is still working out the relationship between church and state, institutional religion and politics. And the state also has to work out that relationship, and it may be ahead of the church in that process. In Northern Ireland, the same process is underway, and though Rail is somewhat maybe behind the big divorce that has taken place in the Republic, not all of unionism has caught up with the separation. And neither have the churches, even though they are all Ireland institutions. But there is no rowing back on the separation of church and state. It's here to stay. And after 1600 years of Christianity in Ireland, it may be a very positive place to be. If, as is likely, the Christian faith came to Ireland a century before Patrick arrived, the faith that got here in the 4th century was already the faith of Christendom. A century later, when Patrick wrote his classic Confession, he included in it a creedal formulation of faith. He was writing to defend himself against various criticisms, and he made a clear statement of his faith and belief. The creedal statement was not original to Patrick. It sounds very like the Apostles' Creed, already in existence, and a summary of the faith believed by the church. That was Patrick's point. He was an orthodox, authentic believer and member of the church. The faith that had taken root in Ireland was from the beginning the faith of Christendom, the shape of faith that followed Emperor Constantine's early 4th century Edict of Milan that established Christendom, and which by the end of the 4th century is the only legal religion of the empire. Church and state, throne and altar are now one, and the shape of the faith is the faith where there is no separation between church and state. They are in bed together and in each other's pocket. And until now, we have never known anything in Ireland but Christendom and the faith of Christendom and the integration of church and state, or the inseparability of religion and politics. If you like, it's been a power-sharing arrangement. But now there is a separation of powers. Until now, in a sense, the secular did not really exist. Something momentous has happened on the island of Ireland. Not only does the separation of church and state shatter any kind of religious nationalism, it shatters the Christendom model of faith. The shape of the faith has broken down and is no longer believed by perhaps the majority of Irish people, certainly not by the majority of Irish young people. Apart from the loss of political power, influence, dominance, the end of the shape of the faith is the most difficult reality for the churches. At times there's a lot of structural, institutional tinkering going on, even positive adjustments, but no reforming, reimagining, reshaping of theology and the faith. Coming to terms with the separation of church and state is perhaps enough to process at present, but the shaping of faith beyond Christendom will have to be engaged sooner rather than later if a faith is to survive in Ireland. And this is not just Ireland, this is a European and a North American challenge. Christendom, imperialistic Christianity and faith has collapsed. The shape of things to come is causing us, many causing deep grief and dislocation, and a lot of it is unspoken but painfully felt. Traveling around the urban centres of the Roman imperial world, Paul was aware of endings, as was Patrick in the 5th century. But Paul spoke of the acute pain as birth pain, the possibility of something new being born. We have been here before in Ireland. In the 16th century, the Tudors invaded Ireland and Ireland became England's first colony. Henry VIII needed a divorce from his wife, who had not provided an heir to the throne. So he broke with Rome and declared himself head of the Church in England. Anglicanism, a hybrid model of the Reformations, was born, and it came to Ireland with the Tudor invasion. Now, across Europe at that time, the religion of the ruler became the religion of the people. Church and state were inseparable. That didn't happen in Ireland. The Irish did not become Anglican. 90% of its people remained Catholic. But along with colonisation, the Anglican model of the Protestant Reformations was imposed on Ireland, and Anglicanism became the established church in 1560. Penal laws excluded Catholics and later excluded Presbyterians from official life. Queen Anne's Test Act of 1704 made participation in Holy Communion in the established church a condition of public office. And all of the Anglican or Church of Ireland bishops sat in the Irish Parliament until its dissolution in 1801. The 18th century was the era of Protestant ascendancy. The ascendancy Anglicans, or members of the Church of Ireland, being around 10% of the population. So the state church was the church of the minority. State religion, domination, land ownership, and colonialism were all inseparable. In the 19th century, England was beginning to think about democracy. It was a time of strikes and protests and riots as aristocratically governed England was being dragged by the people towards reform and democracy. In 1832, the Reform Act was passed. When it was first read to Parliament in 1831, the Tories erupted into hysterical laughter. The bill was passed by only one vote. The second bill had a majority of 136. Well, it didn't stop widespread violence and gang warfare, but it was a small step on the road to greater democracy. It added 217,000 voters to the voting system. But if England was struggling towards democracy, and Ireland, since the Act of Union in 1801, is part of the Union of Great Britain and Ireland, wouldn't this open the state to the Catholic majority in Ireland? Irish Catholics would also have a vote. And what would this mean for the Protestant ascendancy and the established church? Reluctantly, Catholic emancipation was voted for by Parliament in 1829, with effect both in England and Ireland. In 1869, William Gladstone was Prime Minister and began a moral crusade to change things in Ireland in the direction of greater justice and equality. He introduced his bill to disestablish the Irish Church. Parliament passed the bill. The Church of Ireland had believed that it was the only true national church and had a God-given right to lead the Irish nation. So disestablishment was incomprehensible, a traumatic experience. As 1871 began, there was no longer an established state church in Ireland. Church of Ireland Bishop Alexander of Derry said that breaking the church-state relation would lower the moral atmosphere and endanger Protestantism. His spouse, Cecil Frances Alexander, best known for her hymn writing, such hymns as There Is a Green Hill Far Away, and an opener still to King's College Cambridge Carol service each year, Once in Royal David's City. She wrote an anthem for the 1st of January 1871 for St. Colum's Cathedral Choir in Derry. And at morning prayer, the choir sang, "Look down, Lord of heaven, on our desolation. Fallen, fallen, fallen is our country's cry. Dimly dawns the new year on a churchless nation. Ammon and Amalek tread our borders down." Now, Ammon and Amalek recalling two hated and violent enemies of ancient Israel. And despite the presence of the Catholic Church and Presbyterians and Methodists in 1871, it was now, according to the anthem, a churchless nation. The Church of Ireland almost fell apart. The church assets, which ran into millions even then, were dispersed though the Church of Ireland was not left in poverty by any means. Disestablishment or the dismantling of church-state relations was a desolation, a moment of utter despair and a deep trauma. Ireland has never had a constitutionally established church since 1871. But what emerged were culturally established churches. From 1850, Cardinal Paul Cullen was shaping a very powerful Catholic church. It became a powerful institution in Ireland, dominating life in church and community. Clergy became powerful and exercised near absolute authority. Described as the Cullenization of the Irish Catholic Church, it was the church that became equated with Irish nationalism, and was the church that dominated and controlled so much in the Irish Free State and later the Republic of Ireland. It was Cullen's church that came to an end in 2018, now culturally disestablished and a clear separation of church and state. And this may be no less traumatic than the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland in 1869. Irish Protestants dominated the northeast of Ireland, and by the end of the 19th century, the Protestant churches were identified with unionism, and they were totally opposed to home rule for Ireland. The three larger Protestant churches approved the text of the Ulster Covenant, and their three leaders were among the first 7 signatories, pledging to use any means necessary to defeat the conspiracy. There was no clear water between unionism and Protestantism. The Protestant churches accepting partition in 1921, though by the following year they were all adamant that their churches would not be partitioned. The Protestant churches between 1912 and 1922 were imperialist, the crown rights of Christ and the empire being the same, as a late 19th century Methodist statement asserted, and was asserted again by a Presbyterian moderator in 1936. But now the empire has gone, and so has imperial Christianity in its institutional and theological forms. For the Catholic and Protestant churches in Ireland, whole worlds have collapsed. There may still be a reluctance to acknowledge that worlds of power and status and privilege and cultural establishment have gone. Even denial that the faith is in a place in Ireland it has never been before. That is trauma and a desolation for many, a grieving experience and a process. But where now? And at this point, we can go into groups. Loretta will allocate us to rooms. And there's really only one question at this point to reflect on. Reflect on the journey of Christian faith in Ireland since the 4th century. The good, the bad, the ugly. Well, what has changed now, and how traumatic and painful do we find the present? But above all, in that reflection, where now? Where do we go from here? So enjoy 20 minutes, good conversation, and see you then. Faith in the secular. And we talked about the 1600-year-old journey of Christian faith in Ireland with its many highs and lows. There is truth in the land of saints and scholars. It wasn't all an exaggeration. Early Irish monks did much to save Europe by helping in the renewal of faith and culture. And the contribution of modern Irish missionaries to other continents has been immense, both Catholic and Protestant, even though a lot of it was on the back of empire and part of an imperial expansion and domination at times. And there have been those dark moments when Irish Christianity has colluded with the politics and ideology of violence, and when faith has acquiesced in the instrumentalization of God and been a driver of religious nationalism, and the church's treatment of women and children and abuse scandals, and when power has been corrupted and abused. All of this portrays the dark shadow side of the faith. And the churches have been at times discriminatory, exclusive, sectarian, racist, obsessed with sex and sexuality, and some might think incurably homophobic. So the history of Christianity in Ireland embodies the good, the bad, and the ugly, because Christianity is people, and people are flawed. And Christianity is also about institutions, and institutions are about the use and the management and sometimes the abuse of power. Paul, I suppose, was right when writing to those problematic house churches in the Roman city of Corinth, little communities of ambivalent Christians, that the good news of the faith, he said, is always in earthen vessels, fragile and clay pots. Or when the later Gospel of Matthew was written to a community of faith, perhaps in Antioch, that in a field or patch of grain, wheat and tares grow together, and even harvesting is a risky challenge. And the 1600 years of Irish Christianity reflect all of this. Where are things now? Things have always changed, and faith, when viewed historically, has always had a capacity for change. In one way, it is why Christian faith is still here, for better and worse, after 1600 years. But we are in a different place now. The quotation from W.B. Yeats has been overused and even abused, but we risk quoting him again. All has changed utterly. And in the last 100 years, certainly it has all changed. The religious institutions have moved from a power base to a place with little social and political power. They've gone from center stage to the margins, from being culturally established to culturally disestablished. Churches have gone from being privileged to being deprivileged. The collapse and death of Christendom is one way of describing what has taken place in Europe, including Ireland and now North America. And another is to recognise that in the last perhaps 60 years, Ireland has become a much more secular society. We're not clear enough yet as to what being secular means. There are three like-sounding words, but each, I think, is different. Secularization is the reduction in practice of faith, but more so the decreasing influence and role of churches in the public square. Churches control less and less social and public power. Education, of course, is a big area where the church's role has diminished. A century ago, though, they controlled the educational system, and in the new Northern Ireland, the churches fought a battle for educational control. There's a lot less control now, though still significant, and the churches still battle. In Northern Ireland, I think the dogs in the street know that we cannot really afford our segregated education, as the cost of the sectarianisation of education is colossal. However, the churches want to maintain a status quo, and education being the last power base, perhaps, that they have. So secularisation is the reduction of the church's power and role in social and public life. In some cases, it is a consequence of marginalisation, and another situation, there has been self-secularization by the churches. Secularism is the insistence that not only the churches, but all religions have no role or place at all in the public square. Religion is private, politics is public. There is no place for any religious voice in public life, and religion should remain in the private sphere. Well, secularism here is often being as intolerant as religion has been in some of its history. And secularism also runs against everything we stand for as a pluralist and participative democracy. Secular fundamentalism is as toxic as religious fundamentalism, and both need to be called out for what they are: oppressive. Secular is very different. Secularization is again the diminishing role and power of religion in public life. Secularism is the denial of any role for religion in public life. Secular is the separation of church and state. It is the separation of powers. Now, secular does not mean the end or elimination of faith, but the liberation of faith from the politics of power, and that will also mean the liberation of churches from the corruption of the politics of power. It might also mean the liberation of churches from the corruption of power within their own systems and structures. But in Ireland, we now have the separation of church and state, north and south, though maybe in different forms. We are still in the process of realisation and painful dawning of the new reality in Ireland, the end of Christendom, including the end of the Christendom faith as we've known it, and the reality of the secular and the secular reality of pluralistic democracy. Now, apart from the retreat into certitudes and forms of piety and being in denial, there is very often perhaps a lack of capacity now and confidence on the part of the churches to engage with public life and the socio-political, economic and environmental issues of our public time. Having lost their public role and social power and having self-secularized, the churches are still trying to work out what has happened and what any new role will look like. Now, in this struggle, we may learn from mainland Europe and the European Union. Because for the churches, there is Article 17.3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And Article 17.3 reads like this, or at least part of it reads like this. Recognizing their identity and their specific contribution, the Union shall maintain an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with these churches and organizations. The organizations are philosophical and non-confessional organizations. Now, there may be importance here, an importance as a model of church-state relations and of the relationship between faith communities and a democratic and secular Europe. The voice of the churches can be heard in a pluralist, democratic and secular society, with other moral and ethical voices, not as dominating and controlling, but still a real voice with all the other voices. There is a very clear separation of church and state in Europe, and a very real place in Europe for moral voices of faith and philosophies of life. And there may be a model here in Ireland where churches empty themselves of power over, of domination, of control, and yet have enough confidence in their identity and specific contribution to embrace this model, relationship and contribution to societal well-being, eco-human flourishing, and the common good. In Brussels and in Strasbourg, when the churches engage and meet with the European institutions, and Irish churches, as all Ireland churches, can still do that, being both in and out of the European Union. When they meet those institutions in Brussels and Strasbourg, they do not advocate for the church, but they do advocate for the human and for the earth. In regular dialogue with the powers, the institutions of governance and democratic institutions, the churches are not looking after their own interests or talking about themselves, but with the issues and the ultimate concern of the human and the earth community. So in Irish churches, there does perhaps need to be a letting go of power, a self-emptying of power, privilege and status that the early Christian leader Paul called for in the church at Philippi, struggling to find its identity and purpose in the Roman Empire, no less. And when Paul called for the faith community in Rome and Corinth to, quote, become the justice of God, what did he mean by that? What role were these tiny minority groups of believers without any power or status in the Roman Empire, what role were they to have in these centers of political and social power? Paul was no quietist or pietist, no otherworldly saint. It was in the public place that Paul called on these small, powerless faith communities in Rome, Corinth, and Philippi to become the justice of God. Luke Bretherton, an English Anglican, teaches theological ethics at Duke University in the United States. And he suggests two creative and positive roles for faith communities in the secular world. Religious groups, not just the church, have the potential to organize and nurture, and here I quote from Bretherton, have the potential to organize and nurture a faithful, hopeful, and neighborly politics of a common life. Organize and nurture a faithful, hopeful, and neighborly politics of a common life. Can churches with others get on with that? And the other is a reminder from the church's book and the role of being an active community of suspicion. Bretherton writes, the Bible preaches that the faithful should exercise a judicious measure of suspicion rather than paranoia, so they can identify the sacralization of injustice, the normalization of idolatry, false worship, and the hypocrisy of religious and political leaders, such suspicion is the well-being of prophetic critique, a species of loyal opposition. The prophets recognized suspicion and demystification as necessary adjuncts to true faithfulness and maintenance of a just and merciful polity. And then he quotes from Amos 5, verses 21 to 24. Well, this is living faith in the secular, and there is no faith or faithfulness apart perhaps from the secular. So can the churches get on with being active communities of suspicion? Well, we've some time. We might want to ask ourselves, can we embrace the secular? And what does it mean in the secular to become the justice of God? And how, to pick up Bretherton's 2 points, how can the faith community nurture a neighbourly politics of a common life and be an active community of suspicion?